Good evening and welcome to the 2021 McGill Friends of the Library F.R. Scott Lecture. My name is Lenore Harris. I am Vice Chair of Friends of the Library and a proud McGill alum. McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. 7 months ago, McGill University celebrated its 200th birthday, one of Canada's first universities to reach this significant milestone. From the outset, a gold standard of excellence was established by its founders. Many changes have occurred within and to the university to continue to meet the evolving needs of students and professors. Currently, one of the most vital organs of the university, the McLennan Redpath Complex, is about to be transformed into a cutting-edge nexus for teaching, learning, and research in the digital age. Named for the inscription on the lintel over the original library door, Fiat Lux, or Let There Be Light, is a project that is being realized through a combination of philanthropy and institutional support. I would like to recognize Colleen Cook, Trenholm Dean of Libraries, for her vision, steadfast focus, and unswerving dedication to this mammoth project. The Friends of the Library is proud to have been an early supporter of the Fiat Lux project by contributing to the funds required for the initial feasibility study. Our volunteer group continues to focus our efforts on promoting the importance the library plays in both student life and the greater community by fundraising, offering 3 free annual public lectures, and showcasing the multitude of resources and extraordinary collections the library possesses. Presently, we are raising funds to build an information service hub, which will be located on the ground floor of the reimagined McLennan and Redpath Library buildings. When much of the world was paused 19 months ago, our library barely skipped a beat. Study hubs were implemented, library pickup service was organized, and a virtual reference service was put into place. On September 1st, the library reopened to students and current McGill faculty. Despite rigid COVID restrictions, the students' excitement was palpable, further confirmation of the tremendous importance the library and its staff play in student life. Last May, Friends of the Library lost an exceptional friend, the Honorable John Montgomery. A distinguished jurist, John became involved with the McGill Library in the early 2000s. His commitment to and interest in the library was recognized when in 2007 he was named Friend of the Year. Our board meetings were graced by John's presence and contributions as he helped guide our mission with his insights, expertise, and wit. John and his wife, the Honorable Pierrette Rail, generously sponsored the F.R. Scott Lecture for several years. This act was particularly meaningful to John as Scott was a professor when John studied law at McGill. John was an outstanding champion of the library. And now for this evening's program. The F.R. Scott Lecture, established in 1989 to honor the memory and stellar career of Francis Reginald Scott, an eminent constitutional lawyer, poet, author, intellect, and politician. Scott won Canada's coveted literary prize, the Governor-General Award, twice, once for nonfiction for his essays on the Constitution, and once for poetry for his collected poems. He held the distinction of being a student, professor, and dean, all at McGill School of Law. His passion for human rights was underlined by his being a founding member of the first Canadian Social Democratic Party, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, and its successor, the New Democratic Party. This evening's event has once again been graciously sponsored by the Friends of the Library Chairman, Don Walcott. Don's commitment and dedication to the library knows no bounds. He works tirelessly and enthusiastically to ensure its success. Our heartfelt thanks and appreciation to you, Don. Finally, I have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker, Daniel Mendelsohn, one of America's most prominent classicists today. As is evident from the many people tuned into Zoom this evening, Daniel has a huge following. An internationally best-selling author, critic, essayist, and translator, Daniel was born in New York City and received degrees in classics from the University of Virginia and Princeton. After completing his PhD, he moved to New York, where he began freelance writing full-time. Since 1991, he's been a prolific contributor of essays, reviews, and articles to many publications, most frequently The New Yorker and the New York Times Book Review, Harper's, and New York Magazine, where he was the weekly book critic. 2 years ago, he was named editor-at-large of the New York Review of Books and the director of the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, a charitable trust that supports writers of nonfiction, essay, and criticism. A member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Association, he sits on the board of the American Council of Learned Societies. In his spare time, just kidding, Daniel teaches literature at Bard College. Daniel has penned 8 books, including New York Times bestseller and international bestseller, The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, which has been translated into 15 languages. His best-selling book, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, and his collection, 3 Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate. His translation of Homer's Odyssey will be published by the University of Chicago Press in 2023. His field of expertise extends from pop culture to the ancient classics. An acute critical eye and a love of language are present in all of his writing. The list of accolades that Daniel has received, both in the United States and abroad, is extensive. Among them includes the American Academy of Arts and Letters Harry Vercel Prize for Prose Style, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Barnes & Noble Discover Prize, the NBCC Citation for Excellence in Book Reviewing, the George Jean Nathan Prize for Drama Criticism, and Princeton University's James Madison Medal. In the very short time that we have corresponded and talked, Daniel reminds me of a Renaissance man whose love of literature, the classics, poetry, music, and history continues to grow each day. And we, his audience, are the very fortunate beneficiaries of his passions and knowledge. This evening's conversation will be moderated by Allan Hepburn, James McGill Professor of 20th-Century Literature. Allan's research focuses on the novel, British, American, Irish, and Canadian. His areas of interest include 20th-century fiction, contemporary literature, and aesthetics. He has written 3 books, the most recent titled A Grain of Faith, Religion in Mid-Century British Literature, edited 7 books, and authored many articles. He is the recipient of numerous awards, honors, and fellowships. A few notes. Daniel and Allan will talk for 30 minutes, after which there will be a Q&A session. Any questions should be emailed to info.library@mcgill.ca. Don Walcott will deliver the concluding remarks. And now, Daniel and Allan, let the conversation begin.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining us this evening. One thing that Lenore did not mention is that we have been friends since 1986 and that we met at graduate school at Princeton in September of that year. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening.
Thank you.
Our topic this evening, Daniel, is from the classics to pop culture. So I thought I would like to start with some questions about classics, what they are, and so forth, if I may. A critic is a judge, according to the etymology of the term, a word from which we get the word crisis as well. You're trained as a classicist in Latin and Greek with a specialty in Greek tragedy. How does your scholarly training equip you to think about contemporary culture and judge it?
Well, first of all, let me just say how happy I am to be here, as it were, in Montreal, and particularly talking to you, Allan. As you mentioned, we've known each other a very long time by now, and it's always so great to talk to you. I always, it's funny. I always say whenever I publish a review of something, when people agree with me, they'll say, well, he has this classical training. He's got a very long view. And when they disagree with me, they say, well, he has this classical training. All he knows about is the classics. So I always feel that for me, the great advantage of writing as a critic, very often of popular culture, as you know, I write often about television, films, the theater, contemporary novels. I think there's two great advantages of having been trained as a classicist, as a scholarly classics person. The first is, because of the classical works, stand at the beginning of our tradition in the West. And therefore, you have a great advantage by being steeped in this material, because these are, for better or for worse, the paradigms of a great deal of what we are looking at in our everyday lives as consumers of culture. Whether it's a new Tom Stoppard play or the latest superhero movie. So I always feel that in ways that are pretty obvious, because you're so familiar with these great paradigms, it gives you a kind of a perspective, I think, that is really interesting. The other, there are so many things we can talk about. I would just quote the names of some courses I've taught at Bard, maybe as a way of underscoring what I mean. One of them is called The Tragic Heroine from Euripides to Tennessee Williams. Another one is called Odysseys from Homer to James Joyce. When you've got these paradigmatic works under your belt, it allows you to sort of understand culture as genetically, so to speak. The DNA, so you have a pretty good idea of the different mutations that might evolve from that. The other thing, and I know this is going to sound silly because it's so clunky and kind of obvious, but you'll understand this, Allan. When you're trained as a scholar, in the way that we were, at the graduate doctoral level, you are expected to be steeped in the material at an extremely intense level. And that, I think, has served me well because, a thing that I do, and this is connected to what I just said, actually, is whenever I'm writing about something, I like to give a sort of genealogy. So if I'm reviewing a new novel, I read all of the person's novels. I read a lot of scholarship about them. I read all their interviews. For people like us, that's de rigueur. You wouldn't imagine as a scholar writing an article about something when you hadn't basically read everything there is to read. And I remember when I first started writing as a freelance writing back in the late 80s, early 90s, and the editors were always so shocked. I was a book critic at New York Magazine for a few years. My editor was always so shocked if they assigned me a novel because I had read the person's other earlier novels. And he said, do you really have to do this? And I said, yeah, I really have to do that. So I think both the praxis that we learn, as scholars has, I think, served me because I'm interested in the kind of genealogies of the works I'm interested in. So those are just two things off the top of my head.
Daniel, I want to ask you a question of, it's totally out of sequence, but it always occurs to me that and I'm dying to ask this. Your graduate work was on Greek tragedy, but whenever I speak to you, it's your great and rich sense of humor that comes across. How important is comedy to being a good critic?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I mean, so, as and I'm sure many people in the audience know, I've come to Montreal actually to talk about this book. I wrote this very big Holocaust themed book, and I remember, and then I did some event, and I remember getting an email from someone. They said, "You're funny," and I said, "Well, yes, actually, I wasn't going to end up in the Holocaust book, but." I do think it's obviously a great tool of the critic. Possibly, you don't want to work it too much, but sometimes, it's obviously an interesting tool to wield as a critic. And I think more generally, look, I'm not just a critic, I'm a writer, so I'm on both sides of this fence, and I know what it's like to be on the receiving end as well as the giving end. And so sometimes humor can allow you to make a point, even a pointed point, so to speak, in a way that is easier to take if it's couched with a little, a grin, so to speak. And of course, we all know that humor can be used to devastating effect in a review. So I always say sometimes the best thing you can do is just quote the person, and you don't even need to be mean, But yeah, it is an interesting and important item, I would say, in the quiver of the critic. You can't overdo it. I can think of some people who are very funny, but if you do it too often, it starts to seem glib. People are waiting for the jokes instead of the points. So that's something you have to balance. I think it's something you need to figure out.
Oscar Wilde.
Yes,
Yes,
absolutely.
as a critic who used comedy to devastating effect.
Yes.
Daniel, I'd like to ask you about how some works become classics. Why some works go into a kind of fallow period, as it were, before they become classics. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about literary works that become classics. Is this accidental? Is there a rise and fall in the making of classics where certain classics fall out of favor? They're not read anymore. I'm partly thinking about the sort of controversies that are swirling around. Should one undo the classics curriculum altogether and so on? But I'm really thinking about what makes a classic and why do some works succeed and others don't?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's one of the great questions. I mean, we could talk about this for 4 hours if we wanted to, and that would just be a beginning, although we won't. Look, again, when you're a classicist, you obviously have this is what you think about a lot. The joke is that, so on the one hand, you could say, well, these works are classics because they never stop saying what they have to say to us. That's Calvino's definition. And I think to some extent we feel that, that a work that I'm teaching a seminar on the Iliad now. And I think that certainly one thing that makes a classic is the sense that it never stops telling us things that are true, although the variables are really variable. The Iliad is a relic of a culture that is unimaginably strange, in most ways. And yet it seems to say something so fundamentally true about mortality, the relationship of death to how we construct the meaning of life, war, violence, blah, 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 we all know. And that one really feels. Now, as a classicist, I can also say that a lot of works have entered the canon by accident, so to speak. You know, as you said, actually a Euripides expert. There's a whole slew of plays that we have of Euripides. We have more than twice as many plays of Euripides than we do of either Aeschylus and Sophocles. And that's only because one manuscript from an alphabetical listing of Euripides plays. So in other words, not the canon that was formed in the early Middle Ages or late antiquity, but just somebody's A to Z of Euripides survived. And so we have this sort of random chunk of plays, some of which are not that good, you know, but they're classics, right? So I think one has to be attuned to this. Canons are formed by all kinds of subterranean forces. I think it's a very tricky thing to say, oh, we're going to change you don't change the canon. The canon evolves, certainly, and one wants it to. But it's hard to get rid of a classic that's really a classic for the first reason I cited. You know, you can kvetch all you want about the Iliad and about Greek misogyny, xenophobia, all these things, which we know to be true. But at the end of the day, the power of what it says about things that remain true overwhelms the other things. I am a great old-fashioned believer in that, and I'm not naive about the ugly aspects of classical culture, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, obviously. And so I'm very interested in these current discussions about canons, and people want to change them. It's like a friend of mine in publishing says, you cannot make a book a bestseller. You can spend all you want on advertising, publicity, whatever, but at the end of the day, people are going to decide whether they like it. And to some extent, a lot of this stuff has stuck around because for whatever reason, people have liked it. That said, and then I'll shut up, you look at somebody like Virgil, the most canonical figure throughout the Middle Age. For 1,000 years, Virgil's Aeneid is the central document of Western civilization, with not even Homer, because people forgot how to read Greek for a long time, And I don't think Virgil now has the traction in the general culture that it used to, and it lasted until the 19th century. But for whatever reason, I don't think people read the Aeneid now or feel that it's fundamental in the way it used to be. So these are interesting things to think about. And I think things do rise and fall. And that's interesting too.
Daniel, there's a sequel to that question that I would love to hear your thoughts on. Recently, I was rereading Primo Levi's extraordinary "If This Is a Man," or has another title in the U.S., Survival at Auschwitz, where there's this incredibly moving passage where one day Primo Levi is out walking with his French friend Jean. They're going to get the cauldron of soup, and Jean asks him to speak to him in Italian as a way of learning Italian, and so he starts to recite Dante, and particularly the canto about Ulysses, and he can't remember all the lines. It's this extraordinary moment about the classics and how they either help you to, they're things that survive, but they also help you to survive. Yeah. Do you think that's the case? The classics are things that survive, but also help you to survive?
Well, I'd like to tell a story, and that's a very moving passage in Levi, and it's one that I've brought to the attention of my students. I certainly think so. I've, in a way, devoted my whole career to, not a kind of mindless celebration of the classics, but showing that these things, one can glom onto them and use them as ways of prisms through which we understand life. I did this obviously in my book about the Odyssey, which becomes a kind of a vehicle for thinking about fathers and sons, which the Odyssey is certainly very interested in. Mm-hmm. I always tell this story, which I heard when I was researching my own Holocaust book, The Lost. isn't in the book, but I was interviewing a survivor, actually Mrs. Begley, the mother of Louis Begley, the novelist, who it turns out was born in the next town over from where my family met their fates. And Mrs. Begley told me, I said to her, what was the first thing that happened after the war was over? What did people do? How did life start again after this unimaginable devastation? And she told me that, she said, the first normal thing that happened in 1946, after people sort of came together again, was they put on a production of Sophocles' Antigone in Polish. And that made a big impression on me, because I think, here classics is a discipline tearing itself into pieces over its, alleged complicity and white supremacy and all these other questions. And, they're good questions to ask, and it's an important debate. But I thought, at the end of the day, there's a lot of people who think this stuff is really important enough that it would be the first thing you do after the Holocaust is you need to put on Sophocles' Antigone. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. So I do think these things, because particularly in the Greek and Roman classics, because they stand at the head of the tradition, and I would say the Greeks more even than the Roman, and I don't say that just because I'm a Hellenist and I'm getting a percentage, the sense of a quality of elementalness, that this is, when you look at the Antigone, for example, you feel this is an elemental statement of a fundamental conflict in human life. And that's why they seem like the things you want to clutch onto. They have said it first, and in many cases best. And I think, or at least most powerfully. And they're very hard to get away from. And I certainly think, yeah, I'm very happy to have them in my own life.
In mid-century writing, there's a great deal of classicizing. I think that might be the word that is the right one for this context. You just published a couple of weeks ago an Everyman edition of John Williams, not three of John Williams' novels, his three novels, I guess, including his novel Augustus. And there was that incredibly strange moment in the 40s and 50s when all kinds of people were writing these Roman and especially imperial novels, Gore Vidal's, Julian, John Hersey wrote a book called The Conspiracy. Even Thornton Wilder got in on the action with the Ides of March. I know that you're, so to use Latin examples, the Memoirs of Hadrian by Marguerite Yourcenar, that extraordinary novel that everybody should read, all focused on Roman culture, though I could also invoke Mary Renault and Hellenist culture. What do you think was going on in the mid-century with all of these people thinking about imperialism through a Roman lens in particular? Do you have any thoughts about that, the resurgence of the classics? I could even think of Suetonius had a moment in about 1950 to 1965.
Yeah, and then certainly the Robert Graves and all of that. I don't know. That's a question I want to ask you. You're the expert on the mid-century novel, But my gut response is, I think it's not accidental that a good deal of this writing took place after the end of the Second World War. I think the massive political and global upheaval of the war triggered, as we were just saying, a sort of search to go back to a fundamental or originary explanations of why the world is the way it is. The establishment of the American empire in the wake of the Second World War, the emergence of America as a predominant is something that everyone had to deal with, not just Americans, obviously. So my sense is, it would be interesting, I can't say this with any authority, but certainly my sense is that the end of the war triggered a lot of this groping back for the illustrative primary models for thinking about empire. And of course, Rome is really the one that comes to mind. I think also the collapse of fascism it's not just the emergence of America, but the collapse of Italy and Germany, which of course very self-consciously modeled themselves on Rome. The word fascist, as we all know, is a Roman word. Those two events, bookended, so to speak, were an opportunity to go back to Rome and to imagine why this happened the way it happened. But certainly, the Renault thing, I think, is quite different. As you know, I've written about this and we've discussed this. I think it's a quite different thing. First of all, it's Greek, and it has much more to do with mid-century culture in a different way, which was this is again a post-war phenomenon, the emerging gay consciousness, which obviously, as we know, was triggered by huge movements of people during the war, soldiers, the emergence of a sense of being gay as a thing. I know for a fact, because she told me, that Mary Renault, her turn to the Greeks as a vehicle to be able to talk about homosexuality in a normal way. So I think that's a little bit different, but not unrelated to the other thing that I was just mentioning. It's a fascinating subject, which I hope you will write about.
I have written about Mary Renault. So.
No, I know you. I know you.
But
I mean, this larger question, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting one.
Daniel, you're a Francophile and a kind of avowed Francophile, and they love you in Paris. Your books have won various French awards. I was wondering, and I know that you're currently reading the Pléiade edition of the Duc de Saint-Simon because you've been tweeting about it. What is it about French culture that is so attractive to you? And just while you're thinking of an answer, I just want to put in a pitch for your latest book, Three Rings, which is written with a kind of Proustian luxuriance and beauty, a style that you rarely see in American critical writing, but that I appreciate enormously, being a Proust fan myself. Do you see the French as sort of models for a prose style, or do you see French literature, Saint-Simon, Proust, other people, for other reasons as models for you?
It's such an interesting question, Allan. I always think, as someone who writes a lot about authors, and I say when I review people, I try to review them genealogically, so to speak, to sort of place the work within the whole arc of a career. It's harder to do for oneself, obviously. I would say there's two. So there's a kind of emotional / historical reason, which is, I grew up in a kind of ordinary suburb of New York City out on Long Island, where there wasn't a lot of culture. Going to the mall was the great cultural event in the 1970s. And I had a wonderful series of French teachers. And so to me, I think French, just in this kind of vague, not particularly textured way, represented a kind of cultural glamour that was woefully lacking. Also, French was the first language besides English that I studied, and that was exciting. I mean, that's when I realized I was a language person, so to speak. But I do think that one sort of finds one's authors and one's cultures, and just everything about French literature made sense to me for whatever reason. I also think I would say that the rational and analytical element of French intellectual civilization always appealed to me in a complicated way, I would say. Mrs. Begley, of whom I was recently speaking, and was, of all the Holocaust survivors that I regularly interviewed, the one I was closest to, used to tease me about being a sentimental person, which I am. And I honestly think that because being sentimental or letting one's feelings show was so dangerous when I was a teenager in the 1970s, because I was a gay kid growing up in a not gay-friendly civilization, made me possibly overvalue the cool, rationalistic, analytical element. And I found it in the French, you know, I'm a French classicist, much more than a French romantic, although I'm a great reader of 19th century, but it was the 17th century that really excited me when I started learning French. And so I think all these, you know, it's always interesting to think about why you end up doing what you do. For example, I know you got involved in mid-century civilization because your mother was Audrey Hepburn.
True.
True. No, but I always think it's interesting to try to sort of detect the evolution of one's own sensibility. And in my case, I think there were many layers and multiple reasons. But I remember I discovered French classicism simultaneously with Greek and Roman classicism. And this, as you know, over many years now, extends to my non-literary taste, music. You know, there's something, I tend to like highly stylized art forms, Baroque opera, opera in general, where the emotional content versus the packaging, so to speak, is a proportion is extremely, the tension is extremely great. I'm not a great lover of romanticism because I think it's more interesting not to say the thing that you're feeling. And that is obviously also conditioned by my own past. So I think, look, I think it's an interesting subject, but that's just some of the things that come up to mind.
Daniel, I have a question that follows from that, actually. You just mentioned that you were a gay kid growing up on Long Island where, you know, it was not necessarily a friendly environment. I noticed, especially in Three Rings, that the stories you tell are about dislocated people.
Yeah.
Auerbach, or Sebald, or even the lovely story you tell about Fenelon, who is exiled from Versailles for his rewriting of the Odyssey, sent to the north of France. I mean, there have to be worse fates than being in the north of France, but certainly being in the south of France is a better fate.
Not when you're from the south.
Not when you're from the south.
His correspondence, yeah.
Are you particularly drawn to characters who are dislocated? I'm also thinking of an Odyssey where your father, in a certain way, is dislocated into your class. He comes and sits in on your class on the Odyssey. Is it something that you've thought about, or you just mentioned that it's fascinating what topics we end up writing about? Do you think dislocation or that sense of being out of place? Cavafy, you've translated.
Yes.
Another person who's very dislocated.
I absolutely. I would say in this case, again, you know, there's never only one reason. So in my case, I would say it's double. Obviously, I just talked about my personal history where I was dislocated. It wasn't a matter of feeling. I was dislocated out of my element, as it were. And although I have to say, and I've said this many times in interviews, I feel that being a secret gay adolescent, which is not an easy thing back then, as you know, especially before the internet, one felt unbelievably isolated, helped make me a critic, because it makes you look at everything and you're always looking for the code, the secret message, partly because you're also sending them. You know, so yes, I felt dislocated, and I'm always interested in tales of disruption, geographical and emotional. But you also have to remember that, you know, 3 of my 4 grandparents were immigrants. My grandfather, whom I write a lot about in The Lost, came as an adult to America in 1920s. And so when I was growing up, the old country, as they always called it, I like to joke that I was 40 before I realized that that was not actually the name of the country, were hovered very close, you know, memories that you could have been in this other place if history had been a little different. You know, I could have been this. Plus, as you know, a branch of the family was murdered in the Holocaust. And so that there, but for the grace of God, feeling was a very important factor emotionally when I was, the sense that you could have been somewhere else, and if you had been somewhere else, things would have turned out very differently. And I think that makes me very interested in these people, also because, as you know, my grandfather was a great raconteur and a storyteller, and the sense that you could have been somewhere else was very haunting for me. And stories of how you got to the place where you ended up were also very fascinating, and also had a kind of glamour. And so I think that's always made me attuned to these tales of dislocation and why is the Odyssey the great work of my life? It is a tale of a person trying to get home, and all of the conundrums that search triggers, which is the home that you get to. Can it possibly be the same place that you left 20 years earlier? No. So all of these things, I think, are part of this, I would say, atmosphere of my growing up, being haunted by the place that could have been. It makes me sense that.
I have a question from somebody in the audience, which follows on actually very nicely from what we were just talking about. What do you think of the many reimaginings of aspects of the Iliad or the Odyssey, I suppose, too, such as Pat Barker's, which you just wrote about in a very recent issue of The New Yorker? The Infinities also comes to mind, David Malouf's writing. What do you think about the reimaginings of the Iliad, the Odyssey, other classics?
Well, I'm obviously a great fan since I write them myself. So I always think it's a great question, because I always think there's a fine line, so on the one hand, I think it's wrong to sort of act as a sentinel of, what's acceptable, what's an acceptable use of the classics, what's faithful, quote unquote, all that. Sometimes, to me, the most satisfying adaptations of the classics are the most wacky and in a way far-fetched. I guess the only thing that I want from such adaptations, and of course I did just write about this a week ago in the New Yorker, because I reviewed the Pat Barker books, which unfortunately I don't think are as successful as certainly her earlier books, I don't care about the trappings, to some extent, but do you understand the spirit of these works? I think that's the fundamental thing. There was a period when I first started writing for the New York Review of Books, where I was often reviewing new productions of Greek tragedies, and quite often the dullest and least useful ones were the most faithful. There's someone in a muslin schmata playing a flute in the background or whatever. And, and sometimes you have to really shake things up, paradoxically, to get at the real spirit of the class. In fact, that's what I was saying about Pat Barker. I think her World War I novels were more Iliadic than her Iliad novels. But, I'm all for it. Look, what's the worst thing that can happen? They'll be bad. It's not hurting Homer. It's not hurting me. It's not hurting classic. If you want to play with the classics, that's what they're for. And as I never tire of saying, the Greeks were already doing this. Euripides wrote a play in which Helen never ran away with Paris. She was faithful, and there was a little bit of body doubling, and not her fault. Already because we have Edith Hamilton mythology, think that there are myths. The Greeks had a much more fluid understanding of their own tradition, and they played with them more than anybody else. So I'm all for it, but if you do it, you have to be serious. That's my only caveat.
There's another question, and it's one that I've thought a lot about in terms of your writing. This comes from somebody in the audience as well. Do you approach storytelling in the same way when you're writing about the experience of others as when you're approaching your own lived experience?
Well, I think the way to answer this question, it's a very penetrating question. I think the way to answer this question is to turn it on its head, which is to say that I've written 3, well, now 4, I guess, books that have a personal element. I never know whether memoir is the right word anymore. When I think of memoirs, I'm thinking of people, like A Million Pieces, what's his name? A Million Little Pieces. But I've written, so I think that when I write about myself, I try to think of myself as a third person. So it's not so much about how I write about other people. I sort of invert it. Whenever I write about myself, I try to think about myself as if I were another person, a character. The funny thing, so I try to treat myself both respectfully, but intensely and unpityingly as I look at other people. I'll say this, so I know that there are people who have read my book about my late dad. It's a great tribute to him. So in my first book, The Elusive Embrace, which was about being gay, but becoming a parent and blah, 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 I had a lot about my father in that book. And some of it was quite tough because we had a quite tough relationship at the beginning. And I was very anxious about sending him the manuscript, but since he was in it, I felt I needed to. And he wrote me back, he called me back, and this was my father to a T, and he said, I thought it was good. He said, because it's more important to be true than to be nice. And I, by nice, he meant complimentary, and, and I knew what he meant. And I try to do that to myself as well as to my other characters, because you have to remember when reading memoir that the Daniel Mendelsohn who is in my books is not me, in the sense that it's not all of me, it's the parts of myself I put in the book. I remember after my first book came out, going on blind dates with guys, and I would say, well, I was born in Long Island. They're like, yeah, I read your book. And I would think in a kind of wounded way, I would say, but that's not me, that's just the me I create. So I do think you have to have this kind of double vision and think about yourself as if you were someone else in order to be able to write that kind of work.
So there's a follow-up to that I think is really intriguing. The way that if you imagine yourself in the third person, what you do with information about other people. And I've noticed that this comes up in Three Rings to some extent, and especially the new biography of Sebald that's just come out, where he would purloin information and anecdotes from other people, right, reapply them. But I mean, this is not new. Proust does this all the time. And Saint-Simon would, be busily running around court and hearing things that were going on in the court of Louis XIV, and then going back to his cabinet and writing it all up in his diary. I mean, this is a tried and true tactic for literary success. You write about in whatever tonality you want, scandalous or honest or what have you. What do you think about the ethics of using other people's information in that way?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated question, and I think to some extent I don't think there's a blanket rule. So for example, I mean, although I will say, just as a blanket statement to contradict what I just said, in general, because it touches on a larger issue that's been on a lot of literary people's minds, I'm a great advocate of appropriation. That is the writer's job. It's all you do. You're appropriating your things you remember, your memories, other people's memories, things that happen to you, things that happen to other people. I don't believe that there's anything wrong with that. Now, having said that, would I pass off a story that happened to someone else as something that happened to me? No. That's a different kind of, would I retell a story? Sure. I did that for 503 pages in The Lost, but those people knew I was doing it. I had their permission, but then again, there was always these sort of interesting nuances that raise these funny questions. So I would interview people, say for The Lost, and I said, anything that's in this interview is something I might use, and they understood that, and then people asked me, well, did you share this manuscript with them before No. They gave the interviews, blah, 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 you know. So I think it's not easy to answer in a blanket way, but in this day and age when there's so much anxiety about appropriation, I think because it is a related question, right? And I've just been reading about the new Zabel biography. I haven't read it, had a chance to read it yet myself yet, but it's tricky. I mean, if someone passes off a story without telling you that it's yours, and it's a living person with whom you have a relationship, that's a little trickier. But if I heard some story about some random person and decided I was going to work it up into something, I'm not sure that's terrible. That's what writers do. I'm sure every novel in history, every short story in history was triggered in some sense. You know, I know this is something very much on students' mind. I said, you know, without appropriation, there wouldn't be literature. And why is it always the case that appropriation is seen as a negative, insulting thing? You know, I always think, you know, all of Roman culture practically was appropriated from the Greeks. Take it as a compliment and shut up and say thank you, you know. So I don't know. I'm a little impatient with that stuff, but it is tricky when you get down to these personal nuts and bolts. Like if I confide in you, Allan, you know, something, and then it pops up in your next article, and you know, that's a little weirder. Which reminds me, we have to talk about something after this. No, just kidding. You know, so it's a complicated question, but I think in terms of fiction and this sort of recent notion that novelists can only write strictly about things, cultures that they belong to, I have no patience for that stuff. I just don't.
Daniel, we do have to talk after this because you outed me as the son of Audrey Hepburn, and so I'll get endless numbers of emails asking, is this true? When in fact my mother's name was Audrey Hepburn, but it was not the actress Audrey Hepburn. So I just forestall 1,003 messages.
I was going to say the chat box must be hopping, but I remember the first time I heard that at Princeton, before I even knew you, and somebody said, oh, there's this guy and his mother is Audrey Hepburn. I thought, oh my God, how fabulous. And then I remember when I met you and it said, my mother is Audrey Hepburn, just not the Audrey Hepburn.
There's all the difference between A and Audrey Hepburn and the.
That's right.
Another question for you from someone in the audience. How much, and you might, I know there's a story about the loss that you might want to answer this question with. How much of your books is planned out in advance, and how much reveals itself through the process of writing?
Well, a lot. So I always tell I was just meeting with my Iliad students the other day, and they have a paper due, and I always make the same joke. I said, you know, and you've got to write an outline because it's got to be organized, and you can't just, although I myself never write outlines and have never used an outline. So to some extent, I would say these things sort of grow, you know. I mean, I'm talking about a book now, you know, but even when I write these long review essays, I don't necessarily know. I know what I know, but I don't know how it's going to go, if that makes any sense. So I do my homework, I percolate, I brood, and then I start writing. And you know, sometimes I have some sense of where the different bits need to be, but quite often, if it's a work of criticism, I think part of the drama of a review should be how you came to think what you think about the thing. And that is more exciting when, to some extent, you let it happen while you're working. But this is founded on a huge amount of research. You know, you don't just sort of start writing. And with the books, I would say very much, it's more a matter of having certain ideas that come to you, and then you suddenly see a kind of landscape of how they might work out. So in that sense, it's more things occurring to you. But of course, when you're writing a book, especially like The Lost, you know, it's a big book, it doesn't happen all at once. So for example, I could say the use of the biblical exegeses in The Lost, you know, the narrative is interrupted and I reflect in brief passages on parts of the Genesis, book of Genesis. That wasn't part of the plan at all. And I was already writing the first part, and I suddenly thought, or actually I was writing the second part, and I thought, oh, this biblical stuff could be really interesting right here. So I put it where I was writing in the second part, and then I looked backwards and suddenly saw how it could all organize itself in the first part and in all the ensuing parts. So sometimes you just have a notion and you can suddenly see how it's supposed to fit.
We are coming to the end of our time. I'm going to ask you one more question before Don Walcott comes in to close out the proceedings. But it follows from you were just saying about asking your students to write essays. Has your teaching, so this is another question from the audience, how has your teaching changed or impacted your writing, if at all?
Very much so. And it's funny, I have a great friend and mentor now for almost 30 years, Bob Gottlieb, who was a great figure in New York publishing. And I once was thinking of leaving teaching. I said, it's too much, and I have these books to write and articles and deadlines. He said, you cannot stop teaching. He said, because that is what makes your writing what it is. He said, because essentially in these long essays, whatever, that's what you're doing. You have immersed, he always says, criticism is a service industry. And I think that sense of a kind of conversational tone, of a sort of taking someone through a text and showing them what excites you about it, which is something I still feel very strongly when I write about a thing, whether it's the New Yorker piece about Pat Barker or in Free Rein, the sense of leading someone by the hand through a text that you have come to love or that you care about, or a play or whatever. And that, I think, comes from teaching. That's the primary impulse may be pedagogical, actually. And so I've now come to realize that, and I, of course, did not quit. But yeah, I think it's a wonderful question, because I think that impulse informs my writing, obviously, as well as my teaching. This stuff is great. That's how I always feel. This stuff is great. Don't you want to know about it? Let's talk about it. So
I am going to ask Dawn to close up the evening for us.
Thank you, Allan.
Thank you. Well, my name is Don Walcott. I'm chair of the Friends, and this was really a stimulating conversation. I was just sitting thinking, I wish this could have gone on for another half hour to an hour. It's just so fantastic. I'm going to speak to Lenore afterwards and see if we should lengthen our lectures just to involve it, because this was just so terrific. So thank you so much, Daniel. Really enjoyed it. And Allan, your facilitation was just so smooth, and both of you for making this lecture into such a lively and informative and far too short hour for us all. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Why don't we all wave our hands in Zoomer appreciation for this? I think I've done this in other meetings, but I think it's just terrific. We all wave our hands at the end, because you do get to see that it is, we really do appreciate it. Also, I would be remiss if I did not thank the committee who after so much effort put this lecture together. Our marvelous vice chair and head of events committee for Friends, Lenore Harris, Shelley Pomerantz for her invaluable assistance, knowledge, experience, and support, Stephen Spodek for his help and helpful presence in all the meetings, and Lauren Goldman for her marvelous technical expertise. Thank you all. I also would like to recognize that person who has guided and led the library so wonderfully for the last decade, Dr. Colleen Cooper. It is such a privilege to be able to be your friend. And one of her major achievements will be to bring Fiat Lux to fruition, the remaking of the McLennan Library. The architect's drawings, and this is interesting, are now being worked on, and we will very soon be able to show you what a wonderful library will be reimagined on the lower McGill campus. And I should correct myself and say that her name is Colleen Cook, not Colleen Cooper. And finally, I'd like to thank you for participating in this virtual lecture. It is so great to see so many friends of the library gathered together to hear about something we all love so much. Thank you. And remember, as I said last year, why not take some time to read a book? I can even think of a couple of excellent ones suggested today. The Lost, an Odyssey, and Three Rings. And please note that our annual Shakespeare lecture is coming in January. More details to come. And again, thank you, Allan. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
Please all stay safe and keep well. Thank you. Good evening.